Okay, let's get started. I'm Dexter Palmer. Um, I was told that we're not supposed to do introductions very much, Joyce, so I will not mention that you've written over 50 novels. Uh, but I was thinking that given the theme of the seminar, which is influence and adaptation, we could talk in particular about sort of three of your novels that are sort of closer to genre novels, and then think about what they say about genre themselves and their relationship to it. Because when you write genre books, and here I'm specifically thinking of two of your Gothic novels, Mysteries of Winterthurn and The Accursed, and the speculative fiction novel that you wrote just this year, Hazards of Time Travel. They're never really straight genre novels. They are they're very clearly aware of the history of a particular genre, but they often seem to be interrogating it to me. And so let's see what comes out of that. So first, I just wanted to touch on Mysteries of Winterthurn, which was originally published in the 1980s and has recently been reprinted. And it's it's one of your cycle of Gothic novels, and with a sort of cross between that and detective fiction. And you've said in sort of a recent bit of writing on the book that I saw, you mentioned that it was your favorite of your books in a way, that you had an interesting experience with writing it.
Yes, it's very hard to talk about work that is so subjective, and there's a feel that each novel, or maybe each work of fiction or poetry, is some sort of strange manifestation of an interior state, an emotion that is inexpressible. It could almost be like a strand of music. And the feeling is so deep and profound in the artist, if I can use that word. It's very hard to express that which is inexpressible, because the work of art that's the product of that may take many years. You can work on it for months and months, But it begins as this almost inexpressible sweetness or sorrow, or I often write out of a sense of loss. I think that sense of loss where it isn't intellectual but visceral, so you feel like your heart is sinking with the tragedy of life that we lose so much. So in Mysteries of Winterthurn, the interesting thing for the writer is to find a voice for working in the Gothic or 19th century mode. Obviously, if you're writing from the 20th century or the 21st century, you're not contemporary of the people about whom you're writing. So you're sort of looking at them through a telescope, and you're trying to find a voice that's a mediating voice between your contemporary voice and the more natural voice of that time. So an interesting experiment for a person who loves language is to find a style that is somewhere between your style that's colloquial and readable in the 21st century and the way people were actually writing and thinking in the 19th century. For the more obvious difference, their sentences were much longer.
Yeah.
And it was a much more literate culture. I think, in fact, the statistics state that there was more literacy in the 19th century, maybe the later 19th century, than there is today. There are more illiterate people today. There may be more people today who don't read, they're like functionally illiterate because they actually don't read. In the 19th century, everybody more or less had to read. There wasn't television or radio and so forth. So you needed to be able to use language. So people who were not particularly educated and not intellectual, nonetheless, they kept diaries, and they were able to write letters to one another that were quite remarkable when we look at them today. So in writing the two novels that you mentioned, the Mysteries of Winterthurn and The Accursed, I had to find the narrator, and that was very exciting, and that's the difficult part, to find the voice. When I'm writing a contemporary work, I also do find a voice, but it's much more, it's not quite as experimental.
Yeah, because I did notice reading Mysteries of Winterthurn, and I read it on a Kindle as an ebook, and the sentences were both very long and sometimes went over like multiple pages of the screen. No, I mean that in a good way. But I also want to point out that they have very meticulous punctuation in a way that's, I think, unique among among all your works to this particular book that I know. Things like M dashes followed by commas, which is of characteristics of the 19th century. And it was an interesting experience for me each new book teaches you how to read it in a way.
Yes, yes. Well, I love to experiment in writing. I'm really sort of thrilled by the idea of experimentation. For instance, you could think of a work of fiction, Dexter, I'll just give you this, a free sort of hint. A work of fiction that was a certain amount of punctuation, like you have the punctuation first, and it's really wild and exciting, and nobody ever done that before. And then you just sort of, fill it in with something that's appropriate to the form. I love the idea of doing things like that. I once wrote a little Gothic work, because I'm so drawn to the Gothic, because it's a way of legitimatizing our dreams, taking these little wisps and tendrils of the most fantastic experiences we have every night when we sleep. They're so beautiful and sometimes so powerful. The emotions are more intense often than our emotions during the day. To sort of take them and give them a legitimate place in literature by writing about what we call ghosts or vampires or werewolves, and we could say they're psychological projections of different states of mind. If you write about a ghost, you're writing about being haunted, and we're all haunted. So if you're having a dream about someone who is no longer living, that person appears to you maybe in his own or her own being, but if that were a story, it would be a ghost, And yet the sense of loss and the sense of there being an appropriate manifestation of that loss, that still holds, when you're working on the context of language, to give it an actual portraiture and to kind of respect those fleeting and elusive things.
There's one other thing I wanted to mention in general about. I don't want to get into the plot details of Mysteries of Winterthurn, just because I don't want to give anything away. But I would say that if I were to expect what I think of as a conventionally structured detective story in which the villain is very clearly indicated by the end of the story and that villain receives justice, then that in the 3 sections of that book, that doesn't seem to be anything you're particularly interested in doing. And you seem to be sort of, in a very funny way, actively challenging that, because there are moments when, say, the narrator and Xavier, the detective, both have an idea who a given killer is, but everybody else in the town thinks something else. And so they're particularly, and in fact, when Xavier suggests a solution, nobody likes it.
Yeah. Also, he often doesn't really know, like in the last mystery, he just can't acknowledge who the murderer is.
Yeah.
Some things we just don't allow ourselves to think. So he's this wonderfully flawed sort of human detective, which maybe we all are, trying to find out some truths. But then when you realize the truth is just so painful and horrific, then you suddenly sort of veer off in that direction. It's said that in terms of politics, that facts don't matter in changing people's minds. That people may see some facts, and if they just kind of delete them from consideration. But I love my character, Xavier, and the novel Mysteries of Winterthurn is a sort of, it's nothing like it's not a satire. It's a sort of nostalgic look at a kind of detective fiction that maybe is not written today, maybe 19th century, where a very loving and overwhelmingly approving portrait of a detective figure who's somewhat of a pioneer in forensics and a certain kind of detection. And so looking at him uncritically and almost worshipfully, this is the way Xavier is presented in the novel. That's not my position, but that's the narrator who's speaking. And first we see him when he's 16, and then he's older, and then he's a little older. Then he retires because it's so awful. He's discovered in his detection. But as I remember, Dexter, it's been a while since I wrote the novel. I did research into 3 unsolved American classic mysteries. And one was something like Lizzie Borden, but not identical with Lizzie Borden. It was a little different from that. The one is called The Minister and the Choir Singer, which may have been solved. That took place actually in, do you know about this?
No, I don't.
I think New Brunswick.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was quite some time ago. It was a time when the Ku Klux Klan was just sort of beginning to organize in New Jersey. There's a strong Klan presence. I read about that in The Accursed also. So that, The Minister and the Choir Singer, which, I mean, nobody's read this and you've probably never heard of it, but that was a real lurid tabloid mystery that was in the news, and there was a trial and so forth. And then the third is a serial killer, and that probably is an appropriation of something that really happened. So I would do the reading in the detective fiction and true crime of an era, and see the crimes that had not been solved. And sometimes there's a crime that people think is solved, that is a consensus, but that literally or officially it's not solved. So that's kind of exciting, I think, for a writer to take a mystery, an actual true crime event that was not satisfactorily prosecuted, maybe, because they didn't know enough, or there wasn't forensic science at the time. But when we look back upon it, we think, hey, wait, they didn't even seem to investigate this side of it. Today, we would probably immediately have looked at a different suspect. But in those days, if you were a little bit unusual, let's say you're the only Jew in the community, or one of the few black people in the community, then it just seemed that the attention was placed on you, even though the obvious killer is somebody else over here. So I was looking at that all to prepare these novels to look at classic cases of the past that hadn't been solved.
So there's and sort of to segue into the Accursed, there's a sense in which Xavier the detective is trying to make sort of rational sense out of the world, and the world is always not entirely obliging him. Whereas the Accursed has more of it trades in like outright fantasy more than Mysteries of Winterthurn does, even though it's set in Princeton in 1905, and it's probably the only book I've read where I could see the street where I live on the map.
Oh, that's so wonderful. There's a little tour that somebody gives around in Princeton.
And then there's but except in the novel, there's sort of a portal off of, like a road that I drive down pretty regularly, like a fictional portal that leads to this parallel dimension where there are demons and things
hell.
like that. I always think maybe I should just get out of my car and just walk down and see what happens.
Well, we have the tradition of the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. Maybe you've never been there. That's like South Jersey. And like the Pine Barrens is like that other place. So I called it the Bog, and I kind of moved it closer to Princeton. But just the quagmire of the soul of these terrible hypocrites in Princeton, not now, not now, but in 1905, 06, these incredible hypocrites, these white Christian do-gooder people who were total racists, but they never really acknowledged it. And I mean, they themselves would not acknowledge that they were racist, but they didn't really do anything about the Klan, and they didn't do anything about lynching. The idea of an anti-lynching law, like we don't need that, that sort of thing. The anti-lynching law wasn't passed until what was in the 1950s, and finally in the United States. And so I'm really writing about white hypocrisy and white ignorance of the ruling class, and that they live in these beautiful houses. If you've ever driven through Princeton, or if you know Princeton, these beautiful big houses on Hodge Road. So I just sort of picked them out one after the other. They're enormous, based on, I think, English country estates, and they're beautiful big houses. And now, right now on Hodge Road, you might know, Dexter, there are, I think, 5 of them for sale.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 'cause nobody can afford them any longer. The property taxes are enormous for a house like that. But they're all sort of real places, and I did the research and into that, particularly into the private life of Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I know a lot about Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah. Because this book came out, if I remember correctly, 2013, and it was a couple of years before Princeton University had started to have its conversation about its relationship with
Woodrow Wilson,
who was a university president in the 1900s, and yours was the first version of Woodrow Wilson I had come across that didn't trade in hagiography.
I know,
Yeah.
quite the opposite. People said, "How could you say those things about Woodrow Wilson?" I said, "Well, it's right here in his letters and right in the biography and all that." And people thought that I was making up these awful things about Woodrow Wilson. I wasn't. In fact, I censored a lot. The world wasn't ready for the really awful things. This man was absolutely obsessed with his own digestion.
Yeah, there are some comical scenes with the stomach pump in. Yeah.
He had his own stomach pump. I mean, it's extreme measure for somebody who may be a university president to have his own stomach pump. I can kind of see the symbolic value of having a stomach pump, if you're a president or a professor or whatever at Princeton University. But imagine waking up, like being married to someone like Woodrow Wilson, who was this paragon of the gentleman and so forth, and then as the new wife, you discovered his preoccupation with his digestion. Which, I mean, I don't really want to go into it. It's too awful, but you could just sort of imagine the worst things that you might be asked to do as a wife. We're not going there. So we don't have to venture into the world of Gothic horror. This is just the world of discovering that you're married this person, and many a woman wakes up, and it's too late now.
Okay. Well.
No, I didn't put those awful things in the novel. I don't think the worst is in the novel. Yeah. No, I held back. But he did have a whole closet, like you open the closet door, and it was all these shelves of his particular medicines for all different kinds of digestive problems and other problems. And, they were all taking some form of opioid. They were all taking laudanum, or even Coca-Cola at that time was cocaine, It was Coke. That's what the name Coke means. So they were all kind of, at all times, in a drug state, in a sedative state. I don't know how they lived. And of course, they were all constipated as a consequence. So again, we're just not going in that direction. I can't believe that Dexter led me to talking about these things. I never thought when I set out for Key West I'd be talking about these things. So I really wanted to talk about Northrop Frye and archetypes and airy, abstract things like that that don't exist.
Well, perhaps we could talk about another character in the book who is perhaps not as overtly evil as Woodrow Wilson, who is the actual devil. The devil shows up in the book in various guises.
Yeah.
And it must be, I mean, You must have wondered when taking, it seems like writing the devil is a particular challenge because it's a character that so very, very many writers have come across, that have done it themselves. And how did you go about sort of deciding how to ring a new change on this material, or how you gesture toward like sort of older interpretations of the devil?
Well, we all have our own projections of the devil. The devil would represent that which is completely repressed and denied in yourself, and some phantasmagoric figure, ludicrous to everybody else, some creature with orange skin or funny hair, weird, really, really, really weird behavior. And you look at him and say, oh my God, I love him so much. I'm besotted with love. One of the first scenes I wrote, this is really so long ago, because The Accursed that was published in 2013 was actually written in the 1980s.
Okay.
And I revised it. So this is a long, long time ago. So this beautiful girl, she's really a girl, she's about 18 or 19. She's like the quintessential romantic heroine. She's a daughter of a very wealthy man. She's a very, very good Christian girl, but she's naive. She's walking in her garden in Princeton, and she's gathering all these symbolic flowers, as girls do. I've never actually done that, but here's a rue for sympathy, and here's the hyacinth, and you're doing these little tulips and things like that, and that's sort of like what you're doing because you're this girl. So she glances up, and there's this figure in the garden watching her, and then he comes a little closer, and he's closer, and she sort of falls in love with him. She falls under the spell of him. But then when other people meet him, he's very short. He's obviously some sort of a troll or a demon. He's not really completely human, but there's something, he's cast a spell upon her. And the spell that he cast upon Princeton altogether is a spell of ignorance and refusal to be empathetic with people different from themselves. So it's like the devil is your own ignorance and lack of understanding. The devil is like the approximation of your own soul standing outside you. So they kind of all fall under his spell. Then later on, another character in the novel sees Woodrow Wilson walking across the campus with the same demon, and he's talking away, and Woodrow Wilson's listening to him, and kind of like everybody makes a deal with the devil, sells his soul to the devil, thinking to get something in return, but then there isn't anything in return. But then other characters, there was a sort of a vampire, and here he's just so handsome, and he's got all these characteristics like the Heathcliff vampire, all put together. And as I was describing him, I thought, well, this, but then I sort of thought that, well, he is kind of attractive. If I saw him, would I find him attractive? Because it's just so ludicrous. It's like the vision of Aschenbach seeing the little boy, the beautiful little boy, and he completely falls in love, just like that, and his whole soul is lost to him. And probably if you've actually met the boy himself, you yourself would wonder, what is going on here? It's not really, it's out of proportion. It's so disproportionate. So when we have these weaknesses, and people are weak and yearning and need a savior, or they need a leader or something, they sort of not even seeing. There's a kind of blindness or willfulness. And that's maybe the beginning of literature, the beginning of the spell that's cast upon people who should know better, setting it to some sort of sequence of events.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if we all had perfect knowledge and perfect understanding, there wouldn't be the conflict that we need for literature.
Yeah. So that's maybe a good place to segue into your most recent book, Hazards of Time Travel, which is representative of what for you is a recent turn into speculative fiction. And part of it's set in this sort of dystopian future where there is, I guess, a similar sort of willful blindness to events. What sort of, I guess my first general question is, what's inspired this sort of turn to speculative fiction for you?
Well, it's a good question. I think the whole theme that of under the influence is really very exciting. Well, first of all, I would say, and this is true for all the writers in the room and for Dexter, I think we have to admit it, we don't really know why we do maybe 97% of the things we do. We're under the spell of the unconscious, our own imaginations, and we have inclinations and instincts and so forth. So we don't really know what the great influences in our lives are. Somebody from the outside might see more clearly than we do, but we don't really know. So therefore, those of us who've been around a while, who are being interviewed, we always give plausible answers. I've learned to come up with the plausible. I'm sure Margaret Atwood's been interviewed like 4 million times. That Margaret is the very master or mistress of like the very plausible and very illuminating answer. But when it comes down to it, we're sort of like, I don't know. Say we read 4 million articles in the newspapers or comic books or whatever, all these things that pass through our brains, so many of them, and yet only 13 of them lodged deeply. Like, why would literally one out of 4,000 things that we read, why would that mean so much to us? Like someone would say, well, I was completely inspired by this Norse legend. We heard Victor Laval, I thought was wonderful. I loved listening to him. And as Victor was speaking, I thought, well, I remember, it's sort of coming back to me, there were some fairy tales and legends that really struck me and that sort of scared me. Most of them didn't. They seemed somewhat superficial. Everything is very, very remote. There's no emotional involvement. Nothing's evoked. It's just sort of summary. But the one that really struck me was Pandora's box. And I thought illustration, Pandora was told not to open the box. You don't open that box. That's the panel number 1. You do not open the box. Oh no, I won't open the box. And then as soon as she's alone, of course she goes and she opens the box. And all these things in the illustration, I saw all these winged creatures. Did you ever see that illustration? They're flying out to like large bats and prehistoric things, and they're sort of flying past her fearful face. She's totally frightened and astonished and repentant. But then she quickly closes the lid and hope is left inside. And it's an interesting parable, because that doesn't mean that hope resides with her, or doesn't mean that hope is locked inside and we can't get it. But all these death and fear and cruelty, all these things, the evils are sort of flying around in the world. And that did make a very strong impression on me. Like, why would that? So this novel, the Hazards of Time Travel, started as a novel in 2011, which I remember writing in a notebook. And so almost all my writing starts a long time before it actually gets written or gets published. The first title was Vicissitudes of Time Travel. And for many years, that was my notebook, Vicissitudes of Time Travel. And I would open it and feel this thrill of excitement, and I would write a little bit in longhand. But there were several characters in the beginning, and of course they were going to go in time travel. And they were going to go back in time, or maybe sideways in time. They're going to do some sort of trip. Then as time went on, and I sort of narrowed the story, and it's like the story of Pandora's box, where you're really told not to do something, but you don't hear it, or you're not really listening, or some willfulness. So you do the very thing you're told not to do, and it does have really, really bad consequences. And some years ago, when I had a great loss in my life, I think that I crossed over from being a young, eager, curious person to being a person who just basically wants to survive, as they were talking about. Like, it's not much to say about anything that you got through it. But it's sort of like swimming across a turbulent river. First you're walking in the water, and it seems sort of shallow and warm, and you think, well, I can walk in the water. And then the current's a little faster. Well, I could still walk in the water. Well, maybe I'll swim. Then suddenly the wave just takes you, and you're completely knocked up and down, and you're drowning. And and you basically are totally lost and helpless. That which you thought you could do, you can't do. It's not a matter of courage or strength or pride or morality, just literally you can't do it, you know. So you're tossed around, and then finally you're sort of thrown by the waves onto the opposite shore, and you sort of stagger and get up, you know, and you think, wow. And so all you can do to say about that experience is, well, it had a mythic influence, or it was like the undercurrent of the hero, you know, like basically these awful things happen to us, and then we try to make some sense of it. So with vicissitudes of time travel, it takes a girl back to a time it's called the good place, and it's set in Wisconsin. She's being punished for her subversiveness, and she's in a state. It's not like the Trump era at all. People thought maybe it was based on the Trump era since 2016. The novel is really set in a surveillance state, and there's no personality if there's a president. We never know who he is. I think that's the way of the future. I don't think these strongly personal, populist presidents are going to endure. I mean, this could be like the last one who has this populist appeal. I think the world of the future is going to be very controlled by machines, and I just think it's inevitable. We won't even know who the president is. The president may not exist. It may be a committee of people, maybe a little more like 1984, where it's Big Brother is watching you, but it's just an emblem or a talisman, you know, it's not a real person at all. So my novel is set in that future where there are cameras in every room, as there are now in most public places, I guess. Isn't it the City of London where there's no place that's not being filmed? There's always a camera anywhere you walk in London. So they could pick you up, traversing the whole City of London as you're walking the streets. I think they can pick you up. But within homes and computers maybe now can be set up so that they're watching you. Your cell phone that you have in your pocket right now is monitoring you. Soon that cell phone will be doing brain imagery. Brain image is a thing of the future, and it's actually the thing of the present. It's just going to be refined a little bit, so you can see your cell phone is listening to your thoughts. But then the next step is, why stop at that? Your cell phone is telling you your thoughts, you know? And then maybe a little something's put in your brain, and that thing is telling you your thoughts. So this girl, she's in that world, and she's a pretty normal girl. She's impetuous, and she gives a valedictorian speech that she shouldn't. She's asked a whole lot of questions. She's told not to do that. But her questions are sort of naive and childlike, you know, like, why are we here? And does the universe have any end? Or she asks these questions that we all want to ask, but in a surveillance state, you're not supposed to ask these questions. So the punishment for subversion is to be sent someplace for re-education, so the brain is kind of re-educated. So she's sent back to the 1950s, which is like the last good time before the 1960s, where everything became an upheaval. And the 1950s really lasted until about 1963 with the assassination of John Kennedy. And sort of hell just breaks loose from that point onward in American history. But there was a sort of somnolent time in the 1950s when really terrible things were being done, but quietly, you know, like you didn't know about them, no social media. Of course, there were things like lynchings and horrible girls and women were being treated very badly, raped and so forth. None of this got in the newspaper, and it was never on the news because it was all censored. So in a sense, it didn't exist. So that's called The Good Place, and she sent there for re-education.
Yeah. I can see, because the interesting thing about that, or an interesting thing about your depiction of the 1950s is that you can see these terrible things sort of leaking in around the edges of it.
Yeah.
But the characters themselves are in a position where they don't necessarily have to know about these things in order to get by. But there's a sense that in a few years, just like reality is just going to intrude on these people.
Yeah. Well, the idea of time travel is so basic to our imaginations. You know, if you shut your eyes and you could travel back to a time in your own life that was some decades ago, if you could really remember it with some precision, it would be such an eerie experience. Because you do see people behaving in ways that we don't behave now, and yet they're very much like you. Most obvious thing is people smoking. Like right now, we'd be smoking. We'd be smoking. Oh, maybe not me. Dexter would be smoking a cigar. There'd be some whiskey here, and we'd be sipping whiskey. And there'd be this blue haze of smoke. Did you know that hospital patients smoked in their beds? Can you believe that?
Yeah.
I mean, that wasn't that long ago. Doctors were smoking. People didn't wash their hands. They didn't wash their hands very well, you know. And if you told them to wash their hands, they'd get angry. I mean, we'll talk about doctors and nurses, you know. That'd be insulting. My hands are not dirty, you know. They're teeming with bacteria, but you can't see them. So, a little bit of blood over here, well, that's okay.
Yeah.
The standards, it's just like really eerie to think that we lived through that world. And I was around before you were, so it was even worse in those days. I remember that if you went like this to a smoker, like you blew this, you wanted to get the smoke away, that person would be angry at you. That was considered bad behavior. It was rude. You know, like you're choking to death, and you can't do that. You can't like go like this, you know. That was considered really, really bad. And women endured so much in those days. I actually think we all deserve a medal. The women who just lived through that. Like the men are talking, and they have the sort of a monologue, and it sort of goes on, and you're not supposed to interrupt. You're supposed to listen very carefully, but you can nod. You can nod. That went on like for 50, you know, that goes on for 50 years with some people. I think I've gotten off the track. How we're all time travelers.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Not about Woodrow Wilson, please.
Yes, in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Joyce Carol Oates. I wondered if you would speak a little bit about Blonde.
My novel Blonde?
Yes.
Yes.
And that kind of reflection of absence in the mother-daughter relationship in relation to the male, the father, and husband, and so
Thank
forth.
you. That's one of the closest novels of my own to my heart. It really was such a struggle to write it. And I feel so excited when I even think about it. It's like some profound, exhausting love affair that was really almost hard to talk about. It all began when I was looking at a book, and it was some sort of a history maybe of America, I'm not sure, and popular culture. And there was this little photograph of a girl. She was about 16 years old, and she had brown hair, brunette hair, and she was very cute. And it was Norma Jean Baker in like 1926 or something like that. And I thought, well, Norma Jean Baker, she becomes Marilyn Monroe, but not here. When she was a girl in high school, she wasn't yet Marilyn Monroe, though she was only about 5 or 6 years from being Marilyn Monroe. So I sort of fell in love with that picture. I thought, oh, this girl, who was her mother, and where did she live? And they were sort of like Oates. They weren't literally Oates, but they were very poor people in the Los Angeles area. The mother worked for one of the Hollywood studios, but she had a very low-paying job. And she was a mother where she became impregnated by some man who may have been her superior in this Hollywood production company. It was never known who Marilyn Monroe's father was. But there was a fantasy that he was someone like Clark Gable, or fantasy that he was a famous person. That's so pathetic to have a fantasy that your father would be some famous person when probably he was totally a non-entity and just not a nice person. He never acknowledged the child, and he just disappeared. So Marilyn Monroe, or Norma Jean Baker, she always had a fantasy of maybe her father reappearing in her life. And when I did the research into her life, she was so susceptible to older men, whom she often called daddy. And she married several of these men, and she would call them daddy. Like Arthur Miller was much older than she was, and she called him daddy. And Joe DiMaggio was also older. But there were many other men she had relationships with. I didn't write about them. The strategy of a biographical novel that's based on real life is you have to be very selective. So if Norma Jean Baker had like 6 miscarriages, I really only wrote about 1. She was in a number of foster homes and orphanages, but I wrote about 1 orphanage and 1 foster home. So everything was just sort of selected, and that part would stand for the whole. So when I did the research into her films, I started, of course, with the first movie that she was in, and went through the years and saw her Don't Bother to Knock with Richard Widmark was her first movie. She was very young. She looks like she's like 19 or 20. She was a starlet then, and she was actually very wonderful in that movie. She plays a psychotic girl. She's attractive, but she's not glamorous. This is like before she becomes Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. That sort of solidified that image of her with the blonde hair. But before that, in Niagara, she plays a femme fatale. She's a fatal woman, a type in noir films. The very beautiful but icy cold, extremely cold, manipulative woman that she plays in Niagara. And that was a role that she played very beautifully. And then with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, it's like the antithesis. She plays the little girl, the baby. She's like infantile sexuality, whereas in the noir films, it's more this very mature, almost a kind of weird, almost sexlessness that she arouses desire in men, but she feels nothing. She's icy cold herself. So I did the research for the novel with great love and great excitement, like waking up in the morning with such a thrill to be seeing another of her films. She's probably the most underrated film actress in history because she got so typecast after Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Then Andy Warhol appropriated her image in this sort of ugly, mass-produced image that you see of Marilyn Monroe with the hair and kind of a grimace. That's sort of gone out to be her brand. But the real woman was not like that, and the real girl, Norma Jean, was not like that at all. For a while, they're not living now, but I did know people in New York City who knew her. And she would take the subway around the city, and she would go in the Strand bookstore, and she would wear a loose sweater, and her hair would be under her cap, and she wouldn't have any makeup on. No one had any idea who she was. She loved to just be an ordinary person. And she finally was just sort of lost, I think, in the whole Hollywood product. She made millions of dollars for other people, but when she died, she was so poor, with so little money in her bank account. Her body was sent to the morgue, the county morgue, where paupers would go. There wasn't enough money to go to her funeral home. That's the most famous actress in our history. You think of how that woman was appropriated and exploited by, I'm sorry to say men, because I know men in this audience are not like that, but a man, no, I'm sure you're actually not, but the male film industry is sort of chewing up people and spitting them out, getting their stars hooked on drugs so that they're very easy to deal with and, not uppity and so forth. She was, I've talked too long about Marilyn Monroe. Obviously have a great deal of invested emotional interest in her. She became a drug addict. There was always a studio doctor, and he gave injections, he gave barbiturates, he gave sleeping pills, and then he gave amphetamines to get people up for their scenes. And he was sort of in the pay of the studios. And many of these Hollywood actors became drug addicts because of that. And it was not their fault at all. They basically trying to get along. So I identified very much with Norma Jean. And the only terrible thing about the novel was, because she seems to have maybe committed suicide in real life, I didn't have any other recourse as the novelist. I had to go into that tunnel. I couldn't back around. I couldn't have a happy ending. It really had to take her through the very end. And the last beat of her heart, that's the end of the novel. I don't go any farther than that. Thanks for that question.
Anyone else? Oh, okay.
Hi. Of the 4,000 books I've read in my life, We Were the Mulvaneys is one of my 13.
Oh, thank you.
And it's so disturbing and made me so angry. But I've never forgotten it. It was just an incredible book, wonderfully written. And I'm just wondering, was that a story that you wrote based on something you'd read? Did it actually happen?
Yes, I love
it's so well told, it had to have come from something real.
Oh, well, I really love to talk about Mulvaney's. I think of a novel, especially a somewhat long novel, like a family novel. I think it was like a river, and these tributaries go into it. So a number of different streams go into it. So that novel would have begun back in my high school days, where one of my closest friends had an experience that was always kept secret. And today we would probably say it was date rape. But those terms didn't exist so long ago, decades ago. The idea of date rape or sex crimes didn't exist. Domestic violence, those terms are more contemporary. If a man chose to beat up his wife and family, very often police officers would not cross this threshold. They don't cross the threshold of the door, because that was considered the private life. It's a domestic issue. Even today, sometimes jurors will acquit a man who's almost beaten his wife to death, saying it's a domestic issue. Let them work it out between them when one person's being victimized by the other. So this girl, who is a wonderful, wonderful girl, a very strong Christian girl, I mean, she was very Christian, she was a very good girl, and something happened to her that changed her whole life. And she became, she was very popular and she was very pretty. While not my closest friend, she was a friend. And it was always these whispers, you know. So the boy who had probably done this to her, he was fine. I mean, maybe people made jokes or something. Maybe he made jokes, but she was the one who never really got over that. So there was like a cloud over her life. Then years later, I had another friend who was disowned by her family. And then my own father, at some point, not late in his life, but at some point, he became when he started being ill, he sort of lashed out in ways that reminded me of King Lear. I mean, every one of us has a family figure who was like King Lear at some point. And so the novel also has this influence of King Lear, where the girl is disowned by her family. And I always thought, it didn't come to that with my father, but he became kind of emotionally irritable, and he wasn't himself. I guess his illness made him different. So I was so stunned by that change that I wrote this novel. What would it be like if your own father disowned you? So there's a scene, and my next novel, that hasn't been published yet, is the same situation. So it's something that's deep in my heart, that is influenced. But I could say, it's influenced by King Lear, but that's sort of a superficial influence. And so The Mulvaneys, to me, is a novel in which I put my kitty Muffin, because a real cat goes all through the novel. And I wanted to write about a family that lives with animals, and about a girl whose closest friend is her cat. And I wanted to try to write about that mysterious, really spiritual connection that we have with animals, And it's like two-way. We give them love and they give us love. And the animals sort of understand us, but there's no language. The animal can't speak. There's the touch. The animal lies against you, or you pet the animal. And that's kind of something that happens between animals and people. Like one animal and one person. Sometimes an animal like relates to one person in a household. And I wanted to try to write about that in a way that wasn't sentimental, but it's actually very hard to write about that. It's the easiest thing in the world to have an animal you love, who loves you, but it's the hardest thing in the world to write about.
That's all the time we have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.